Women's fashion from the 1960s through the 1990s. The young adults of the 1960s were tired of the old rules and the conservative society. They wanted something new, and this was the decade of optimism. During the post-war period, people had time to rebuild both financially and socially. This allowed young adults to be able to create their own identity. For the first time ever in any fashion era, the young became the leaders of fashion. This, along with sexual revolution, the space race, curiosity for other cultures, the Vietnam War, and the women's liberation movement, were some of the ideas and thoughts that changed fashion forever. The different color combinations that were formed in the 1960s were exciting. They represented that people were more free and happy after the post-war period, and they were very different from the conservative look that dominated the 1950s. Patterns inspired by opt art were dramatic, and people had never seen anything like it before. The early 1970s fashion scene was very similar to 1969, with a little bit more flair. Polyester was the material of choice, and bright colors were everywhere. Men and women alike were wearing very tight-fitting pants and platform shoes. By 1973, most women were wearing high-cut boots and low-cut pants. Early 1970s fashion was a fun era. It took some of the best elements of the 60s and perfected them. Some of the best clothing produced in the 1970s perfectly blended the mods with the hippies. Just when it seemed pants couldn't flare anymore, the flair was almost gone. By the late 1970s, the pantsuit, leisure suit, and tracksuit was what the average person was sporting. In the 1980s, women preferred soft fabric and neutral colors. Silk blouses were all the rage throughout the entire decade. Pants were a very popular option for women, and many styles were sold. Denim jeans were hot, arriving in styles with bleaching, dyeing, and even some expensive designer jeans came with pre-made holes in them. The mid to late 80s were a period of experimentation, from fabrics that changed colors to clothes that were meant to be worn backwards. Nothing seemed to be off limits. Bright neon colors were very popular, and rocking brand names was more important than ever. Women's fashion in the 1990s was very distinct. While it wasn't quite as loud as the 80s, the 90s took on an attitude that tried to be a little smarter and a little classier. Some common articles of clothing from the 1990s included black leggings with oversized sweaters, low-heeled shoes, flannel shirts, sweatpants, Birkenstocks, silk shirts, and plain white Keds. Like most decades, fashion changed pretty drastically from the beginning of the 90s to the end. The early 90s started off exactly like 1989, but by 1993, the 1991 look was so 80s. The 70s look was really hot, with teens wearing tie-dye shirts, bell-bottom jeans, and long straight hair. As the decade progressed, fashion became more similar to what you are seeing throughout the 2000s. The grunge look faded away, and sexy made a comeback. Tight clothing was worn again, and glamour was slowly making its way back into the fashion world.